me to be the ambassador to Cambodia. I've spent time in Cambodia. I've also spent a lot of time dealing with the PRC. Can you tell me how extensive is China's influence in Cambodia?
Thank you for that important question, Senator. We have seen, especially in recent years, but for quite a long time, that Chinese investment in Cambodia has risen dramatically, that Chinese citizens traveling to Cambodia and residing there and getting involved in sometimes nefarious
I think that's an understatement. The influence of China in military affairs, political affairs, economic affairs is extensive. I know that, you know that.
Right.
What I want to talk to you about is how do you stand up to Chinese influence? Because we need our diplomats to be strong. We need our diplomats to stand up to nefarious influence, as you mentioned. It's all over Cambodia. So I want to go back to your time when you were serving at Mission China. First, I want to ask you this. Are you aware of the legislation that Senator Peters and I just passed out of the Homeland Security Committee yesterday dealing with BGI and Wuxi Aptec?
No, I'm not.
These are PRC influenced and controlled companies that take the genomic data of people all over the world, including Americans, and they work with the PRC. This is a grave concern of mine, is exposing any American genetic data to the PRC. Let's go back to your time serving as DCM in China. You understand this, don't you? You understand the approach of the Chinese. Would you be concerned about them having our DNA data?
Absolutely, but...
I'm glad you share my concern. But according to whistleblower complaints back in 2021, when you were in charge of the embassy in Beijing, you knowingly allowed DNA collection from our U.S. government employees through blood tests prior to the entry to China, and it's in spite of the national security and the counterintelligence concerns that you seem to share with me. The U.S. government had no way to verify that China only used these samples for COVID-19. In fact, China refused to anonymize and to destroy the samples. Weren't you concerned?
I certainly was concerned, but Senator, at the time that those policy decisions were made in Washington, and then we were instructed to implement them in China, my understanding was that they were shared with all of the relevant agencies, and I can tell you at Post,
well, here's my understanding.
Beijing, is that we also discussed those with all of the relevant agencies, and I was never, no information was ever brought to my attention that any of the relevant agencies believed that what the Chinese were doing with COVID testing in China would enhance their ability to collect the DNA because they
I think you should have followed the instructions from the State Department, because back in September of 2020, the State Department granted a limited waiver of inviolability. Senator Risch mentioned this. That allowed for pre-departure COVID testing for U.S. personnel so long as conditions remain the same on the ground. But the conditions then were nasal swab testing.
That's right.
They went to blood testing. The PRC even dictated which labs could be used in America. You did nothing to stop that. You did not notify through the front channel, the State Department, as you were instructed to do. You didn't stop that from happening. In fact, you recommended that our personnel comply with the PRC's request. I think that is deeply, deeply concerning. And then we get documents from March and June of 2021 that talk about your consent to this protocol change. Going to COVID-19 blood test, and only at labs that they allowed open the door for the PRC, they gain an inch because you allowed that to happen. And then what happens next? It gets even worse. In early 2021, it comes to Mission China's attention that the PRC has now escalated beyond blood test to go to anal swabs of our personnel in their apartments. That is shocking to me. Did you decide to stand up to the PRC?
Senator, the reports of anal swabs of U.S. diplomats are completely false. And there was an instance that occurred when a U.S. diplomat incorrectly voluntarily complied with that when he should not have, and we rapidly and immediately protested to the Chinese.
So you protested this,
and told,
but you didn't protest them taking our blood samples and exposing our DNA.
I never.
What I'm
in the
saying is we
entire
have to have
time I was-
diplomats that will stand up for American interest and will stand up to China.
Senator-
If you're going to go to Cambodia, you need to be able to stand up for our interest and for our diplomats' interest. You need to be strong against China, not allow them an inch, and certainly not allow them the mile.
Senator,
Mr.
there's
Chairman.
an enormous amount of information here that's incorrect and not true that you're weaving into this narrative. We, Ambassador Branstad and I, throughout our tenure there, we tirelessly pushed back on the Chinese on every single one of the things that you mentioned. With regard to blood tests, at no point ever while I was in China did I waive anyone's diplomatic immunity or instruct anybody in China to comply with a request for a blood test in China. These blood tests,
in the U.S.
I understand, these blood tests in the U.S.,
At labs, the PRC dictated.
that's right.
You did allow that.
That was a Washington, D.C. based decision and policy. I was never consulted on that issue because that was a requirement that the Chinese embassy in Washington put out there for travelers to China.
And I just read you what the notice required. You were supposed to notify the State Department through the front office channel if conditions on the ground changed. Conditions certainly changed going from a nasal swab to taking our blood test and DNA.
Well, every single change of any type that happened with blood testing or requirements in China that occurred during my tenure was immediately, almost in real time, informed to the department. We were having daily phone calls, email exchanges, and weekly conference calls on all of these issues, and every
So you're
change
saying you
was
did,
communicated back.
under the limited waiver of inviolability that Senator Risch mentioned, you did notify the front office channels. You did do that when this condition on the ground changed, when this condition moving to blood test requirement. You did notify them as required.
That was a development in Washington and not in Beijing. They were quite well aware of that because that was a requirement that the Chinese embassy in Washington notified to the State Department about requirements, including visa requirements, that people would need to travel to China. So I can talk about what happened in China, and I can assure you that everything that happened in China, we shared, again, almost in real time, any changes, any modifications, any additional requirements that were imposed in China were shared almost in real time with our counterpart offices in the State Department and informed to department leadership at the time, which was Secretary Pompeo and Undersecretary Bulletow.
Did you relay at any time your concerns about the Chinese government having access to our blood samples?
That was a discussion that occurred in Washington, the interagency.
I remain very concerned about this. You're aware of my legislation to try to address it. We have to keep the sanctity of our DNA here. And I want our diplomats to be protecting Americans at every turn possible. I would expect that from each of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Woodhouse.